Nurses of Reddit, what were the most haunting things someone said on their deathbed? Story number 1. Not a nurse, but my grandfather was put into a 24/7 care home with severe Parkinson's. My mom and grandma had spent 4 years basically taking care of him constantly and needed a break for a couple weeks, although visiting him every other day in shifts. I went one day alone, and he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I need you to get me home so I can die. I can't do it here." I tried saying everything I could to the nurses and my family to get him home without saying what he told me. 24 hours later, he got rushed to emerge. As he was dying, he looked at me and said, "Don't let it bother you," and died. Still bothers me. Story number 2. Not a nurse. I was on the 911 unit that got a call about a hit and run. Cops were on scene first. The area of the city I worked in was rough. Some guy and his girlfriend had got into a fight in the parking lot. It ended with the guy running over his girlfriend, then backing up over her. Needless to say, she wasn't doing well, and her vitals were tanking. We loaded her up, with a fireman and police officer joined with us in the back of the rig. She kept mumbling, "Tell my mom. Please tell my mom." And naturally, I figured it was her asking us to let her mom know she was hurt. The hospital takes care of that, and I put it out of my mind rather quick as we were working over her. She flatlined before we arrived. They did not get her back. My partner was finishing up her paperwork, and we turned to give her wallet back to the staff. The nurse on duty, who I knew pretty well, was reading a dirty piece of paper. She looked disgusted. When I asked what was up, she simply put the piece of paperwork down. It was a letter that was picked up near her purse on scene. She had gotten accepted into a college. I realized then that in the ambulance, she was asking us to tell her mom she got into college. That is a deep sadness I have never forgotten. Story number 3. I'm not a nurse, but my grandparents passed 3 days apart from each other. My grandmother was diagnosed with lung cancer and began treatment. About halfway through, she sat everyone down and told us she felt her life was so fulfilled and would stop treatment, essentially choosing to pass peacefully. My grandfather was healthy, the type of man who went to the gym until he was 90. Just in impeccable shape and health, honestly. My grandmother was on her deathbed for a long while. In and out of consciousness, no longer communicating often, and only eating ice chips. It really tore my grandfather up. And one day he was at the grocery store and just had a heart attack and passed away within minutes. A few days later, my dad and I were sitting with my grandmother in her room. I was holding her hand and remember my dad telling her my grandfather is waiting for her whenever she is ready and she won't have to go alone. My grandmother spoke her first words in a week and said, "He's right here with me. I see him." My dad said, "What's he wearing?" Which at the time I thought it was an odd question. But she giggled and said, "He's in my favorite gray suit. I think we're going out." She was such a fashionable woman, so they always were so well dressed. She passed that evening. We had their funeral together, and my dad dressed him in the suit she told him my grandfather was wearing. They were so in love. Still to this day, I have never seen anyone compare to what they had. A part of me feels my grandfather died of a broken heart, but also knew she needed him onto their next journey. It tears me to pieces every time I think of her last words. I know they're happy and together. I miss them both so much, the world is a little dimmer without them. Story number 4. Not a nurse, but it seems that most people here are recounting last things people said prior to dying, so here's mine. My grandmother, who raised me, had pulmonary fibrosis and was in and out of the hospital multiple times leading up to her passing. My mother-in-law worked as a nurse at the hospital my grandmother had been admitted to and called me letting me know that her vitals were bad and I should rush to there as soon as possible. I made it and sat at her bedside while she had her mask on. I knew but didn't know at the same time that this was the last time I was going to see her alive when I first arrived. I held her hand and cried while begging inside to let me feel her pain so she wouldn't suffer. I told her I loved her and everything was going to be all right while trying to hide my tears. She looked at me very deeply with love in her eyes and said, "It's all right, Mio. I love you, but I need to prepare myself and I need you to go." That's when I felt the room change. It felt heavy, and I knew this would be the last time we'd exchange words. I walked out of her room and turned around and said I love you, to which she replied, no matter what happens, Mio, I'll always love you, but go. Leaving that room was the hardest thing to do, but I respected her wishes. By the time my wife and I made the 20 minutes drive home, I received the call that she passed. My mother-in-law's nurse coworkers on that floor mentioned that my grandmother had really stuck it out until I showed up to say our goodbyes. Story number 5. I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home for just 2 months, brand new. This gentleman was assigned to my caseload the entire time I had worked there and was on hospice the whole time, but had seemed to be doing well. This night, I was working with him, and he seemed off. I talked to him and explained what I was doing to care for him, but he just sounded so angry and confused. I was new to this, so I didn't know quite what to do, so I pressed on. He got so freaked out, he took his oxygen tubing and tried to wrap it around my throat to strangle me. I got away, told the nurse, and was told that confusion and aggression were common when people were dying. He needed his care regardless. I went to care for him again a few hours later, and he looked so docile, so defeated. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at me and told me, I'm real sorry for what I did earlier. Child, that's not who I am. I'm so sorry. I told him it was okay, and that I just wanted to make him comfortable. He thanked me and said the line, I'm going home. He just kept repeating it and sounded so urgent. I'm going home. I'm going home. I'm going home. I thought he was still confused. He passed away 1 hour later, right after my shift was over. I was the one to hear his last words. Upon learning that he passed away, I immediately thought of those last words. Sticks with me to this day. This was almost 12 years ago, and I don't think I'll ever forget. Story number 6. Not a nurse, but was a cop, and I was with a 20-year-old who took his own life. He checked into a nice hotel, and his parents reported him missing. Anyways, they found out he was in a hotel by a credit card charge. I was the responding officer, and when I arrived, I knocked on the door. He answered, and was really cool. We chatted for a few minutes, and I asked him if he was willing to come downstairs to meet with his parents. He went back into his room, and I held the door open. It appeared he was putting on a jacket, but he pulled out a gun, placed it on his temple, and said, "Fuck my family. This is on them," and pulled the trigger. First time someone mauled themselves in front of me, and wasn't the last. That haunts you years later. Story number 7. From when I worked in private practice. Had a patient get diagnosed with a moderately aggressive, but treatable, throat cancer. We tried everything we could think of to get him to consider treatment. He refused any type of treatment, so after about 3 months, his wife had their 2 adult sons basically carry him into the office at 4:50 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. I was the only nurse in the building. I got him into an exam room. Dude was completely gray, gaunt, and you could hear how close the end was every time he breathed. It wasn't exactly a death rattle, but you just knew his lungs were full of fluid. His sons sit him in a chair, and he starts to slide out. The room was too small to put him on the floor, and the exam table was too high to lift him up on it. I stood between his legs and held him upright in the chair while I told the sons to go get the doctor, told the wife to call 911. We all knew nothing was going to keep the man alive much longer. He patted the side of my leg. It was the most he could move, and whispered, "I should have listened to you all. I don't want to die." He lost consciousness, and all I could do was just keep him from sliding out of the chair until the EMTs got there. After the ambulance got him to the hospital, he lasted about 4 hours. Story number 8. I'm so late to the party here, but I want to share this. I had a rough life. After decades of pain and mistakes, I met this amazing woman. Her family was split on me. Some thought I was a bad choice. Some really liked me because I was at the very least brutally honest with myself. My wife's grandmother loved me instantly with a love I had rarely experienced in my life. She truly was a driving force in my wife's family accepting me. She was a real firecracker. She lived good, had a big family, a great husband. You could see in her eyes from the day I met her she was content with life. She went in and out of hospice, but the last time, the whole family was there. She was completely coherent, awake, sassy as ever. I stopped by to show my love, and I'll never forget. All the kids, grandkids, great-grandkids Family friends were hanging around casually like it was just another day, and Grandma was a tank, so we all knew she'd go home soon. I had to leave to pick up my boys from school. The wife was staying. I made my way through the crowd and gave her a kiss. We locked eyes and had a conversation of a million words in a few seconds of eye contact. She saw my soul, and I promised her I'd take care of her granddaughter. I feel like I walked out of the room backwards, like a movie. Everyone else was doing something else and talking to everyone other than her. She had this twinkle in her eye, and I couldn't look away. She told me she loved me in that look in a way I hadn't received love much in my life. I felt her soul hug me. I knew she knew. I knew that she knew that no one else knew. She winked at me when I went past the door. I knew. I made it around the corner of the hallway and cried for the long drive home. My wife called me an hour or so later saying she had passed unexpectedly. I still feel like my wife's grandma, who was surrounded by a massive family that was close and full of love, gave me one of her last glances to tell me I was loved like I hadn't been much in my life. I see that love in my wife's eyes every day. Story number 9. When I was 16, I worked as a dietary aide in a pretty nice nursing home. There was this one older gentleman that I became pretty good friends with. He always talked about World War II and how he had lost so many guys in his company. Several days in a row, I had noticed that he wasn't coming down to the dining room for lunch or dinner. Went to his room to check on him, and he wasn't there. The nurse said he had a spell and fell out of his bed. His doctor wanted him to go to the hospital for observation. What had really happened is he had a stroke. He got back to the nursing home about a week later, and he really couldn't remember anyone except for me. We talked the day after he got back, and he told me he wasn't doing good. He knew his time was coming to a close. Said it was time for him to pay for all the horrible things he had done when he was over in Europe. He wasn't a religious man, but he asked me where I thought he was going. I said to bed because it's getting close to lights out. He said, "No, Joe. By the way, my name is Mike. I mean up or down." Now, I'm not a deeply religious person either, but I said, "Martin, that's not for me to say." He laughed and said, "I know where I'm going. There's only one place for people who have done what I've done. I've killed so many people, Joe. Most of the time, it didn't matter who it was. We went into buildings just shooting. There's only one place for me. It's what I deserve." I had absolutely nothing to respond with. When I say that experience shook me to the core, I really mean it. That man's face is burned into memory because of that conversation. He passed away the next day. His son said he kept asking where Joe was at. I quit that day. Working in a nursing home is a haunting place. Takes a special type of person to be able to watch people just around you.